Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of family therapy, but with a bit of a twist.
A twist?
Yeah, we're exploring it through this really engaging memoir called Couple Therapy with Yourself by Iván Arranz Garcia. He's a therapist, but he's also a fantastic storyteller.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this book.
He shares a lot of his own personal experiences in it, which I think makes his insights into family therapy so much more relatable.
Definitely. It makes you feel like you're having a conversation with a friend, someone who gets it.
Right, like you're not just being lectured to.
Totally.
And he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff either. He dives into loss, trauma, and all those messy family dynamics.
It's refreshing, actually. He's not afraid to be vulnerable. He talks about his own fears and struggles, which makes you feel less alone in your own.
Absolutely. And it all starts with this interesting detail from his childhood. He was fascinated by a late-night radio talk show, but not for the reasons you might think.
Oh. What was it about?
It wasn't the topics, it was the host's voice. He described it as super comforting, almost like a companion in the quiet hours.
I can see that. Sometimes just hearing a voice can be so soothing.
Exactly. It makes me wonder if that's where his emphasis on the power of internal dialogue comes from.
Could be. That early experience shows how tuned in he was to that inner voice, even as a kid. It's like a preview of his whole approach to therapy, that the way we talk to ourselves, that internal chatter, it's super important.
Right. It sets the stage for everything else. And then we learned about this childhood ear injury he had, a ruptured eardrum.
Ouch.
Yeah. And it leads him to meet his future mentor, Dr. Albert Ciru, through a chance encounter.
Wow, talk about a twist of fate.
It makes you think about how these seemingly random events can shape our lives, doesn't it?
Right.
Like, were we meant to cross paths with certain people?
Definitely makes you wonder. It's like there's some kind of invisible hand guiding us sometimes.
But then things take a more serious turn. Ivan loses both his mother and his grandfather within a couple of years.
I can't even imagine. Those are huge losses, especially at such a formative age.
Yeah, and you can really see how those experiences impacted him deeply. They shaped his understanding of grief and trauma, not just personally, but also professionally.
Right. It's like those experiences become woven into the fabric of who we are, how we see the world, and how we approach our work.
Exactly. He even talks about his grandmother, who, after losing her husband and daughter, develops dementia.
That's heartbreaking.
When she just keeps repeating this phrase, my daughter, my daughter. It's a powerful example of how grief and loss can have this ripple effect on families.
It really highlights the interconnectedness of everything, doesn't it? How one person's grief can resonate through generations.
For sure. So we're starting to see all these early influences shaping Ivan's path. But when does family therapy specifically come into the picture?
It becomes more clear during his master's program. That's when he really delves into the idea of family secrets.
Like those unspoken truths that families sometimes have.
Exactly. And how those secrets, even if they're never spoken aloud, can shape individual narratives.
It makes you think about all those things that might be lurking beneath the surface in our own families.
Right. And how those hidden narratives, even if we're not consciously aware of them, can influence our thoughts, behaviors, and relationships.
He actually shares this personal story about his own mom being ashamed of his grandmother's job.
What does she do?
She was a building concierge, which, back then wasn't seen as a very prestigious job. His mom discouraged him from talking about it.
Ah, that makes sense. It's a classic example of how societal pressures and personal judgments can color our perception of our family history.
It makes you wonder how many unspoken truths are present in our own families and how those hidden narratives might be influencing us.
It's like we're carrying around these invisible scripts that were handed down to us, shaping how we see ourselves in the world.
Exactly. And then another layer is added when Ivan starts living with his mom and her partner Albert, who happened to be a psychiatrist.
So he was immersed in a therapeutic environment, even outside of his studies.
Right. He got exposed to systemic therapy principles firsthand. That idea that each person's actions impact the whole family system.
It's like that butterfly effect thing. A small change in one part of the system can have ripple effects throughout the whole thing.
Totally. There's this one instance where Albert convinces Ivan's mom to let him and his brother resolve a dispute on their own.
So instead of stepping in to fix things, he encouraged them to work it out independently.
Exactly. There was like a mini crash course in systemic therapy, showing the power of letting individuals find their own solutions.
Wow. So Ivan had all these experiences. His fascination with that radio host's voice, the losses of his mother and grandfather, and this immersion in systemic thinking.
Right, and they all come together to form the foundation of his approach. And one of the core concepts that emerges is this idea of the root of peace.
The root of peace. I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
It's a way of processing grief, especially when it comes to our parents, that really challenges traditional ways of thinking.
Oh, how so?
Well, he suggests that true healing sometimes involves confronting difficult emotions, even anger, towards the people we love.
So it's not about disrespecting our parents or anything like that.
No, not at all. It's more about recognizing that processing those complex emotions is essential for true healing.
It makes sense. Sometimes we hold on to those feelings, even subconsciously, and it can prevent us from truly moving forward.
I can see how that might be a tough concept for some people to grasp. I mean, we're often taught to respect our elders, not be angry with them.
It goes against the grain, for sure. Could you break down how this root of peace actually works in practice?
He uses this brilliant analogy of learning to drive.
Okay, I'm listening.
He describes 4 levels of learning we go through on the way to reaching that root of peace. At first, we're like inexpert unconscious, thinking we're doing great but clueless about what we don't know.
Like someone who just got their license and thinks they're a pro even though they've barely driven out of the parking lot.
Huh. Exactly. Then we move into inexpert conscious, that moment when we realize just how much we still have to learn.
Which can be pretty humbling, but it's also exciting, right? Because it means there's so much potential for growth.
Totally. And from there, with consistent practice, we transition into expert conscious. We're skillfully navigating things, but we still have to think about it.
Okay, I'm following. And finally,
We reach expert unconscious, driving smoothly, effortlessly, without overthinking it.
okay, I see where you're going with this. So how does this relate to processing grief, especially when it comes to our parents?
It suggests that working through those complex emotions towards them is a journey, not a quick fix. We might start out unaware of those feelings, then recognize them, and then work through them.
So it's like we're gradually moving from that inexpert unconscious stage of grief to that expert unconscious stage where we've found peace and acceptance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to further illustrate this point, he uses another powerful metaphor, this one about kids and balloons.
Kids and balloons. Okay, I'm curious.
Imagine a child losing a balloon, right? How an adult reacts to their distress actually reflects their own approach to grief.
That's interesting. So how they handle the child's sadness about the balloon reveals how they deal with their own grief.
Exactly. Some might dismiss the child's feelings, tell them to toughen up or distract them with something else.
Yeah, and others.
Others might try to replace the balloon right away, like trying to fix the problem without acknowledging the feeling.
That makes sense, avoiding the emotion altogether. But what's the best way to respond?
He argues that the ideal response is to validate the child's emotions. Let them fully express their sadness or anger about losing the balloon.
To really sit with the feeling and process it.
Right. It's about teaching kids how to process difficult emotions in a healthy way.
Which then translates to how they'll deal with bigger losses and challenges later in life.
Exactly. And the cool thing is that this applies to us as adults too. When we experience loss or grief, instead of pushing it away, we can allow ourselves to feel those emotions fully. Work through them, just like with the kid and the balloon.
It's almost counterintuitive, isn't it? We're often conditioned to avoid unpleasant feelings, but maybe that's part of the problem.
Yeah, maybe leaning into those uncomfortable feelings is actually the path to healing. And this all leads us to another interesting aspect of his work, his use of play therapy with kids.
Play therapy. I've always found that fascinating. Using play as a way for kids to express themselves and work through difficult stuff.
Right. And he was really creative in his approach. Like, he understood that sometimes kids don't have the words to explain what they're going through.
Especially when it comes to complex family dynamics.
Exactly. Play provides a safe space for them to act things out, to explore those emotions and relationships in a way that feels natural to them.
One technique that really stands out is his use of actual chords to represent family bonds during therapy sessions.
Chords, like musical chords.
Yeah, like those thick ropes or cords, he'd use different ones to symbolize the different connections within a family. The bond between parents and children, that sort of thing.
So he was literally giving them a tangible way to visualize those relationships. That's so cool.
And he would actually manipulate those chords during the session to illustrate changes or disruptions in those relationships. So if a child felt disconnected from a parent, he might move those chords farther apart.
Wow, that's such a powerful visual. I bet it helped them understand what they were feeling on a whole other level.
It did. And what's even more interesting is that he noticed this visual representation also had a powerful impact on the mothers observing the sessions.
So it wasn't just the kids who were benefiting from this technique.
No, not at all. It gave the mothers a new way to understand their family system as well.
It's like it provided a new language for them to discuss those complex dynamics.
Exactly. And it highlights how family therapy can impact everyone involved, not just the individual being treated.
That interconnectedness is so important to remember. Speaking of connections, Ivan also shares some personal stories in the book about overcoming his own challenges. He's really open about his fear of medical tests, which stemmed from the trauma of his mother's illness and death.
His willingness to share those personal struggles is what makes him so relatable, I think. It humanizes him.
Exactly. He's not just this expert talking at you from a place of authority. He's been through it himself,
It makes you realize that therapists are human too, right?
Exactly. We all have our stuff. And then, on a later note, he talks about his whirlwind romance with Carolina.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
He almost missed their first date because of a soccer match.
He chose soccer over love.
Almost. But luckily, they did end up going on that date.
Phew.
Yeah. And it clearly went well because they ended up having not one, not two, but 3 weddings.
3 weddings. Wow, they must really love weddings.
Right. Or maybe just celebrating their love with all the people they care about.
I like that. It's like they wanted to honor their commitment in different ways.
Exactly. And speaking of celebrating, another turning point in Ivan's professional life was joining Alex Lidos's team at the Camina Center.
That's where he really started to solidify his unique approach, right?
Yes. He was combining systemic therapy, attachment theory, and all those personal insights he'd gained along the way.
So let's dive into some of the key ideas and interventions that emerged from this blend.
One that really stands out is his Wi-Fi metaphor for connection in relationships. He explains that just like a strong Wi-Fi signal allows devices to communicate seamlessly, a strong emotional connection enables people to understand and respond to each other more effectively.
Such a great analogy. It instantly makes it clear how important that connection is. Have you ever thought about your relationships that way?
All the time. It's such a brilliant way to visualize it. When the connection is strong, everything flows. But when it's weak, everything feels strained, like you're constantly buffering.
So true. And that applies to our relationships with ourselves too, right?
Absolutely. It's about being in tune with our own thoughts and feelings, being present with ourselves, truly listening to what our inner voice is saying.
Which circles back to that early fascination with the radio host's voice. He was already attuned to the power of connection and communication even then.
It's like it was all there from the beginning. And another crucial aspect of healthy relationships, both internal and external, is setting boundaries.
Something we all struggle with, I think.
Oh, yeah, totally. Especially when it comes to people we're close to. It can be tough to say no or advocate for our needs.
It's not always easy, but it's so important for our well-being. Ivan actually draws on his experience working with victims of domestic violence to illustrate how a lack of boundaries can really perpetuate unhealthy dynamics.
It's a powerful reminder that boundaries aren't just about physical or emotional abuse. They're important in all our relationships, even with family and friends.
It's about recognizing that we have the right to protect our own time, energy, and emotional space. And sometimes that means having difficult conversations or making tough choices.
Which can be scary, but ultimately leads to healthier, more respectful relationships.
Absolutely. Another thing I really appreciated about his approach is how he encourages us to reframe past experiences as learning opportunities.
It's so easy to get stuck in regret or self-criticism, especially when we look back on choices we've made.
It's like our minds get fixated on those what-ifs and should-haves.
But he suggests viewing our past actions through a more understanding lens, considering where we were in our development at the time.
It's like giving our younger selves a bit of grace, recognizing that we were doing the best we could with what we knew then.
Exactly. We can acknowledge those mistakes and learn from them without letting them define us. And to help us do this, he introduces this interesting technique called interviewing the internalized other.
Interviewing the internalized other? That sounds intriguing. What's that all about?
Well, it involves giving a voice to those internal messages and beliefs we've picked up from important figures in our lives, like our parents or caregivers.
So all those messages we've absorbed, even if they're no longer serving us.
Right. He gives an example where a therapist asks a client to answer questions as if they were their internalized father.
So it's like having a conversation with that inner critic, that voice that's been shaping our thoughts and behavior, sometimes for years.
Exactly. And by giving it a voice, bringing it out into the open, you can start to examine those beliefs and challenge them.
It's like you're taking away its power by exposing it.
This deep dive is really making me think about my own experiences and relationships in new ways.
Me too. And there's still so much to explore. We haven't even touched on his work with the elderly, which is a whole other fascinating aspect of his approach.
I'm definitely looking forward to diving into that next time. I think there's a lot we can learn from his experiences working with older adults, especially as our own loved ones age.
It's such an important topic and one that often gets overlooked.
It's about recognizing the value and wisdom that our elders bring to our lives and finding ways to honor their experiences and support them through the challenges of aging.
Exactly. And Ivan brings so much compassion and insight to this work.
This is just the tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah.
I'm excited to keep exploring couple therapy with yourself, with you all.
Me too. So last time we left off talking about that really intense dream Ivan describes at the end of his book, the one with the fire.
Yeah, where the hillside where he and Carolina live is like suddenly on fire. What happens?
Right, so firefighters are like desperately trying to control the blaze.
Oh, no.
But it becomes clear that they're fighting a losing battle, you know?
Yeah.
And Ivan and Carolina, they realize that they're trapped.
Oh my gosh, that's terrifying.
And as they're facing this like reality of their situation, Ivan, he turns to Carolina and says, "Today's the day we die."
Wow, that's heavy. It gives me chills. What do you think that dream means?
Dreams can be interpreted in a bunch of different ways, but for me, I think this one's about acceptance.
Acceptance, yeah.
Accepting the things that we just can't control, that life is unpredictable.
Definitely. You can try to plan and prepare, but sometimes things just happen.
Right. And it's about surrendering to the present moment, even when it's scary.
You know, it's interesting because even though they're facing this like really scary situation in the dream, they're together. They're sharing this moment, this experience of like confronting the unknown.
And that, I think, ties back to what we were talking about earlier about like facing those difficult emotions head on, finding that peace within ourselves, even when things are really, really tough.
It's not about avoiding the hard stuff. It's about navigating it.
Exactly. And so after sharing this dream, Ivan, he asks this really, really profound question.
Okay, give me the question. I've got to hear it. What is it?
Well, he encourages us to look inward, understand those inner dialogues we have, face our past with compassion. And then he asks, how might you start practicing couple therapy with yourself today?
It's a powerful question because it forces you to think about like how you treat yourself, how you talk to yourself. It's like he's saying, be your own therapist in a way.
Yeah, cultivate that self-awareness, that self-compassion, really be present with yourself.
And if any of this is resonating with you out there, take some time to sit with that question. Maybe journal about it, try some of the things Ivan suggests, anything that helps you connect with yourself on a deeper level.
I think it's all about exploration and trying things out. See what works for you.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into couple therapy with yourself, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is just how much emphasis Ivan puts on internal dialogue and self-compassion.
Yeah, that's the foundation, isn't it? Being mindful of how we talk to ourselves.
Recognizing those negative thought patterns, like those inner critics that we all have.
Yeah, those voices can be so loud sometimes.
Right. But it's about learning to challenge those voices and cultivate a more supportive internal dialogue, like being our own best friend.
Yeah.
Another big one for me was that idea of processing difficult emotions, like anger and grief, in a healthy way. He makes a strong case for not avoiding those feelings, but actually leaning into them.
And that can be so counterintuitive, We're often taught to push those feelings down, ignore them.
But he's saying that true healing comes from facing them head on, working through them, not pretending they don't exist.
Which is a lot easier said than done, right?
Totally. And something else that really resonated with me was the idea of reframing past experiences as learning opportunities.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
Instead of dwelling on those regrets or, beating ourselves up for past mistakes, he encourages us to view those experiences through a more compassionate lens.
To see how those experiences, even the tough ones, have shaped us into who we are today.
Exactly. And that's a big part of self-compassion, right? It's about extending that same understanding to ourselves that we'd offer to a friend. And another key takeaway for me was the importance of setting boundaries.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
It's something I've been working on personally, and it's not always easy.
Not at all.
But it's so essential for healthy relationships, and not just romantic relationships either.
Boundaries are important in all our relationships, with family, friends, colleagues.
It's about recognizing that we have the right to protect our time and energy, to say no when we need to, and to advocate for our needs.
It's about respecting ourselves and ensuring others respect us as well.
And as we're discussing these takeaways, it's really striking me that these aren't just like theoretical concepts. These are practical things that we can all do.
Improve our lives, yeah.
They're tools for growth, self-discovery.
So as we're wrapping up, I'm curious, what stood out to you the most from this deep dive? What really resonated with you personally?
Oh, man, so many things. But if I had to pick one, I think it would be that reminder that we all have that inner critic, but we don't have to let it run the show.
The internalized other.
Yes, that technique, interviewing the internalized other, that was a real game changer for me.
What did you learn?
Well, it's such a powerful way to bring those negative voices to the surface and really examine them. And when you do that, you can start to understand where those voices are coming from. It's like you're taking away their power by shining a light on them.
That's so powerful.
It's about reclaiming your own voice,
Yeah, absolutely.
and choosing to speak to yourself with kindness and compassion instead of judgment and criticism.
Which I think is really at the heart of what Ivan is trying to convey in this book,
Couple therapy with yourself.
Yes. It's recognizing that the most important relationship we have is the one we have with ourselves. And when we nurture that relationship, it impacts every other area of our lives.
It's like that ripple effect, right?
Exactly. Everything's connected. It's a journey worth taking.
It is, for sure. And, as we wrap up our deep dive here, I can't help but think about the power of stories. All the stories Ivan shares in the book, his own personal anecdotes, the stories about his clients, even that story about Gandhi and the grieving mother, they all do such a great job of bringing these concepts to life.
Oh, absolutely. Stories have this incredible way of connecting us, helping us make sense of the world,
Yeah. And it makes those complex ideas so much more relatable and memorable. It's like you said before, it feels like you're having a conversation with a friend, someone who gets it.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we're all part of this larger human experience, connected by our shared struggles and triumphs. We're not alone in this.
So as we leave our listeners to kind of ponder Ivan's final question and continue on their own journeys of self-discovery, I want to leave them with a little encouragement. Anything you'd add?
Just to be kind to themselves along the way. Don't be afraid to dive deep, explore those inner landscapes, those internal dialogues. But remember, it's a process, and there's no right or wrong way to do it.
Such great advice. And as Ivan reminds us, couple therapy with yourself is an ongoing practice. It's not about reaching some kind of, perfect state of self-love or anything.
No, it's a journey.
It's about showing up for ourselves each day with curiosity, compassion, and an open mind, ready to learn and grow.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into couple therapy with yourself. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time, ready to dive into a whole new topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep connecting with yourselves and those around you.
And remember, be kind to yourselves.
Take care, everyone.